We are very honored to present the next guest on today's show. Her name is Veronica Carbajal. She is an environmentalist fronteriza. She is a community lawyer and an activist running to be mayor of El Paso this November. Veronica has spent her career as a lawyer advocating for vulnerable communities and the environment. A few of her notable cases include resisting gentrification in Duranguito, decreasing pollution from the Asarco Refinery, fighting back a polluting natural gas facility in Montana Vista, and advocating for dozens of tenants facing eviction. She is a Green New Deal champion, and she's even participating in the El Paso Green New Deal Summit as a delegate. Sunrise El Paso is proud to endorse her to be the next mayor of El Paso. And with her experience in local struggles, in her legal expertise, and the lessons she has learned throughout the campaign, Veronica joins us today to talk about why local politics are so important and why local political actions can be empowering in an era of Trump. Here's our interview with Veronica Carbajal. Vero, thank you for being on the show. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Like we mentioned before, we're going to be talking about local politics, and since you are a candidate for mayor, it's a great fit. And to start us off, we were thinking if you could tell us a little bit about your background. So, how did your background lead you to run for mayor, to want to run for mayor?
So I was born in El Paso, as was my mom, as was my grandfather. And my apologies, this is a story. I'd like to tell stories, but I think it
No
helps us
apologies.
to understand why people do what they do. I grew up in Juarez, and we commuted to El Paso every day. And there were things that I saw, right, when we commuted. I saw kids that looked just like me, who had brown hair, brown eyes, brown skin, but they weren't going to school. They were working. They were selling newspapers and trinkets. They were begging. And I didn't understand why, because I knew from a very early age that the reason that we commuted was because my mom, who worked really low wage jobs, could not afford to get us a house in El Paso. And so we lived with my grandparents in Juarez. But I knew that the struggles that we went through to get to school and to work every day were so that I would get a better education and I wouldn't work the jobs that she was working. So when I saw these kids, I would just wondered why our lives were so different, because I didn't see a way out for them. And so when I was about 9 years old, my great-grandfather, we called him Patano, he stayed with us for a couple of weeks, and every morning I would like rush to see him, and we would both have coffee and talk about all his stories. And a couple of days into his visit, I finally got the courage to ask him why he was a politician. He was actually mayor of Guadalupe, Distrito Bravo, which is on the other side of Fabens. And I asked him that because my grandparents did not like politicians. They would read the newspaper every day and they would comment and say things like, los políticos son una bola de rateros, politicians are a bunch of thieves, they can't be trusted, they're only looking out for themselves. And so I loved and respected my great-grandfather. I didn't understand why he became a politician. So I asked him, and he said, yo me uní al partido, el PRI, porque me cansé de ver cómo explotaban a mi gente. So I joined the PRI, the party, because I got tired of seeing them exploit my people. And so I know that we complain about having a two-party system, but in Mexico for over 100 years, there was one-party system, and that was a PRI. Yeah. And what my Patano was referring to was the fact that, what happened during that conversation was that my mind was blown. And I realized that the poverty that I saw, the poverty that kept my mom from being able to afford decent housing for us, the poverty that kept these kids on the streets, working alongside their parents instead of going to school was not divine. It wasn't God saying, you get to be full of opportunities and you don't. What he said to me helped me realize that the things that we see that are unjust are not an act of God, they're an act of people. So it is people who choose to exploit one another. It is people who choose to create these systems of exploitation that trickle all the way down to little kids who have to work at age 6. And so that really changed everything for me, because I realized then that I could choose which side I wanted to be on. And I chose to work for justice at a pretty early age. That said, I never thought that I would follow his example or any other politician's example. I really wanted to provide direct services to people. And I saw that as the best way to give agency to people whose voices are often ignored. And so I did well in school. I went to college, I went to law school, and decided to commit myself to legal aid and to provide work that's been really exciting, as well as I think in many ways it has been transformative. We have managed to transform people's lives in really important ways, and to also transform systems, even though they're small systems. But I think that the work that I've been a part of has helped to change the way certain people behave in our city.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for that testimony. And I think it's very interesting you talk about like direct services, direct aid, and talking about systems, right? Because that's something that we're very interested in when it comes to the climate crisis, right? Because as much as we can take individual actions to change and to be more environmentally sustainable, at the end of the day, we're operating under these systems. So we look at the Trump era, where environmental regulations are constantly being rolled back and climate denialism runs rampant all over federal Congress, even here in our state government. So my question to you is, how can political activism focused on local city level government, how can that be beneficial for our community?
Oh my gosh. It's, I mean, and I think I think that one of the best things that we can do as environmentalists is to bring things home to the very local level, because this really impacts our elections. People historically do not show up to local elections, but they will to federal ones, right? And that's a huge problem. And I think that it's a reflection of people not realizing how much of an impact local and county, local at the level of city and county leadership impacts their everyday, quality of life. When it comes to the environment, even though we have a lot of federal regulations and some federally regulated entities within our city limits, we also have decisions that are being made, every 2 weeks at city council that impact the way our city is going to grow. And I think that's really what the focus has to be of our campaign, and of course of anyone who cares about the environment within the city. When we talk about economic growth, a lot of people separate that from community growth. And to me, they're one and the same, right? And we're seeing that now with the pandemic, that community and economy cannot be separated. And so when we talk about how we're going to grow, we need to take the power back into local hands and talk about how we're going to define value, define opportunity, define growth, and think about the who, what, when, where, how, right? Who is building? What are they building? How are they building it? Why are they building it? And where? And that, I think, is very crucial, because development, when it comes to building new, homes, new commercial areas, tends to be the driving force for economic growth. And we need to realize that we don't have finite resources. We have a huge issue with the availability of quality drinking water, as well as the fact that because of climate change, we need to anticipate that our weather patterns are going to change. And when we continue to build into the mountain, into the desert, into our natural floodplains, we are potentially putting a lot of people at risk. Maybe not immediately, but certainly if climate change trends continue down the road, when we will start to see droughts followed by heavy rain.
Right.
And that, having been through a number of floods, both in El Paso and outside of El Paso, I can tell you, like, it is devastating. It is devastating to go through that. It is traumatic. It can be lethal, and the recovery is extremely expensive. And so for me, again, going back to community, I'm not an environmentalist who cares only about the environment. I'm an environmentalist who cares about people and cares about economy, that we need to also be fiscally responsible, and think about how we spend and what our priorities are, not just right now, but in the future. And so yes, federal regulations are super important, but so many decisions are being made on the local level that people are just not aware of, right? The fact that our public service board is basically giving away public land, because it's so cheap, right, for these developers to buy hundreds and hundreds of acres at once for like minimal amounts per square foot. And so there is a built-in incentive for them to just build new homes. So what happens is that you start to see a degradation of the urban core. And as an environmentalist, you see the impact on the desert, you see infrastructure having to be built out, you see people having to drive a lot more because they're living farther away from the center, where jobs tend to be. So you see, on a personal level, an expense, but then on a local level, you start to see more pollution. You start to see more roads. You see less wildlife. You see all of the impacts of growth that is not responsible, in any way that's fiscally responsible or environmentally responsible.
And that's something that we're trying to aim for here at this show, which is trying to make the case that local politics can be as big and as important as the presidential election, right? Because we know that there's a lot of hunger for justice in those races, but we understand that it can be, like you said, applicable here locally. So going into those systems that you were describing, can you name some of the examples of local governments, legal or political authority, that can help us achieve Green New Deal solutions in El Paso?
Oh, in terms of existing structures,
Right.
when we look at building permits, right? What is being built, where it's being built, and how it's being built is really important. And so when you start to craft energy conservation into every new construction project, you're innovating the construction industry, but you're also saving resources down the road. And you're making that family more financially sustainable. So that's one example. Public transportation is another. There's so many ways to improve on our public transportation. And one of them is really making it free, which is an expense for the city and the county. But when we start to see, luckily we wouldn't be the first ones to do this, right? But there are other cities who are trying to do that as a way to incentivize people using public transit. In the era of the pandemic, of course, we're going to have to take precautions, because cities that rely heavily on public transportation have also been hit by how contagious this coronavirus has been. But that said, I think that there are so many ways that we can improve upon our public transportation system, and to really go after particular audiences, right? There are people who don't realize that public transit would actually make their lives easier. And these are people who don't typically go home during the day when they're at work, right? It could be teachers, it could be doctors, it could be different types of professions where people really, when they go to work, they stay there the 8-9 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And so they did, once you've used public transportation and it has, you use it consistently, it's a huge benefit to not have to drive yourself, not spend money on gasoline and insurance and all of those things, right? But people don't realize that it's a huge impact on our environment to not use your car.
Exactly.
And so I think that if we started to create even not necessarily large scale transformative changes, but smaller scale changes that are really targeting people, they're really getting them to jump on board to these new ideas. Because what we're trying to do at the end of the day is change people's priorities and to change the way that they see the world. Because if there are things that we can implement at the city level that will sort of be top down when it comes to permitting, public transportation, oh my gosh, so many other things, weatherization programs, things like that. But the fact is that if you don't have a buy-in from the community, it's not going to live very long. And what we really want, I think, is for people to start to understand that they have this incredible impact and an incredible opportunity to curtail their impact on the environment and for it to mean something. One of the things that's happened is that, well, I think that happens is that there's a huge distance between us and the impact we have on the environment. Most people have never been to the landfill. Most people have never been to the water treatment plant. They've never been to a recycling facility. To bring it to like the animal rights part of it, they've never been to the euthanasia room at the animal services, right?
Right.
So when they drop off their animal, they're just like, oh, they're gonna get adopted, right? And they feel good about it. But if you really took people through a tour of the shelter and to the back room where healthy animals have had to be put to sleep, it changes you. And for me, I think it was really eye-opening in college that we had field trips to these different locations, right? We went to neighborhoods that were having rat infestation problems. We went to, like I mentioned, landfill, the sewage treatment plant. And not only do you get to see the impact that you're having, because when you put your trash out to the curb, you don't necessarily understand that it goes somewhere. But you get to see that you're having this huge impact on the environment. But more often than not, you get to see the communities that live right next to all of these facilities. These facilities are not in isolation. They are next to houses, schools, communities, right?
Exactly.
And I think if we really start to drive all of those points home, people, it has an impact on people. And I think
Right.
that that's the kind of change that we want to drive. And then of course, have it implemented and enforced through these regulatory mechanisms in every possible way at this city, right? Whether it's, of course, zoning is super important. But when we talk about public transit, we talk about weatherization, the roads, the quality of our roads, what we use to pave our roads, what we use to light our community centers, our street lights, all of those things. I've been involved, as you know, with a number of environmental justice cases, and I always recommend to my clients to do a toxic tour. And those are the tours where you invite political leaders and community leaders to go on a tour of your neighborhood, because people don't realize,
Right.
how the proximity between these polluters and human beings, they don't it's one thing to hear about it and to even see it on a video, but when you're actually there and you get to see and smell and walk and put yourself in people's literal shoes, it changes everything. When we were in Montana Vista, I asked my clients to organize something like this, and I told them, I'm not going to be here. I don't want my presence as a lawyer to curtail other people from coming. So just invite whoever you want and let me know how it goes. And so they got a bus. They were super organized. They had a megaphone. They had stopping points so that people could walk through their streets, streets, that are just right outside of the city limits, that are not paved. People who don't have, natural gas. They have water, thank God, but the streets are terrible. They don't have street lighting. There are stray animals everywhere. And they're also next to a jet fuel tank and then now a power plant. And so it was really important to humanize our story by taking people through that journey.
Exactly.
And so I think to the extent that we can do that at the city, and one of our top priorities for our environmental platform is addressing environmental injustices in El Paso. Because a lot of people don't realize, right? It's become normal to drive by the refinery, and
Mm-hmm.
they don't realize that right next to the refinery are people.
Yeah,
That,
exactly.
you put your stuff in the recycling bin and you feel good about it. You don't realize that most of it is not recyclable, and also what is recyclable is going to end up in neighborhoods like the Chamizal. It's going
Exactly.
to end up right next to Douglas Elementary,
Mm-hmm.
where the recycling facilities have fires pretty routinely, and those kids have to be evacuated. Not to mention the fact that they're also dealing with the traffic that comes from the trash being dumped, vermin, and trash that flies off premises and things like that. And so we have to understand that everything that we do has a price. Someone's paying the price, and we
So
can't forget
yeah,
about it. Just because it's not you, it doesn't mean that you get to forget about it.
definitely. And like you mentioned, it all comes down to awareness, right? Because it's one thing to read about it or to even see it on video, but like to be aware of it, actually see it. And personally, I think that this city is ripe for this sort of revolutionary awareness per se, because like just think about the statistics. Like um, El Paso County voted heavily in favor of Bernie Sanders, overwhelmingly, right? So there's this very um, strong block of progressive voters. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think has been El Paso's biggest obstacle in achieving a truly progressive local government?
I think that it's been slow to evolve. I think that when we think about the progressive agenda, um, it's been around issues that are still very sensitive, right? The right of a woman to choose, um, the right of people who are the same sex to get married, transgender rights. Those things have been relatively taboo in El Paso, despite the fact that we have been historically a highly democratic community, or pro-democrat community. I
Right.
think there was still this, and I say this having graduated from high school in 1994, where I still felt like this community was very conservative socially. That's changed, and I think it's changed for a number of reasons. One of them is that many people, including myself, left El Paso, ran away from El Paso because it was so stifling. I was raised in a very progressive family. We talked about LGBTQ stuff when I was 9, 10 years old, and it was like not taboo. Women's rights were always at the forefront because my great grandparents, separated in the 1940s. Like, I was just raised by very strong women, very incredible men. And so I think for me, my home was very progressive, but my community wasn't. And so when I left, I found, you know, like-minded people elsewhere. And when I came back, I brought those ideas with me. So I think that's had a huge influence. People who are from El Paso who have left and come back. El Paso has also always been a magnet for very progressive people from outside of El Paso. Because of our location, a lot of people have come here, you know, either to the university or to work directly on social service type of issues, on immigration, on colonias, on things like that. And so their influence, I think, is also very important. And I think it's also a sign of the times. I think that the mainstream media, especially the Spanish language media, has done a really great job of addressing issues that impact a lot of El Pasoans. And that is, you know, being underinsured or uninsured, families that are undocumented or have mixed immigration status, low-wage workers, things like that, I think have become a lot more easier for us to talk about.
Right.
Now, some of it too has been brought about with litigation. And so I was around when the Chicos Tacos case came about, which involved two men who were kissing at Chicos Tacos. And they, the security guard asked them to leave, and they called the police, and the police accused them of a different crime. And so then they filed a lawsuit against, you know, Chicos Tacos as well as the city of El Paso. And that was a really important forced conversation for us to have as a community.
Right.
And I think a lot of good came out of it, you know. And so sometimes a lot of these changes have also been brought about because people have had to, you know, bring about lawsuits and bring about conversations about who we are as a community. The case of Duranguito, I mean, when we started to litigate Duranguito in 2016, I really thought that we were alone, that it was going to be another legal aid case where it was just us and our clients. Paso del Sur was starting to really organize, but I did not expect that 2 years later, hundreds of people, most of them young people, right, under 25, were willing to get arrested to save a neighborhood. To me, that was just incredibly eye-opening because I had no idea that El Pasoans cared about their history that much, that they understood all of the underlying issues, right? That it wasn't just about the sports arena. It was about the fact that Chicano and Chicana history in this community has never been respected to the level that it should be. That we have tolerated city councils who, to our face, told us the new face of El Paso is white and European. It is not a viejito who speaks Spanish, who is working class. Those people are dirty. They're the old El Paso. We don't want that anymore. I mean, that was said to us, right, in with, you know, back in 2006, 2007, and 8, when Segundo Barrio was at risk. So fast forward 10 years, and things have changed dramatically, where now you have a lot of young people saying, like, this is not acceptable. We demand more. We demand respect. We demand protection of our elders. I think that El Paso, the beauty of what's happened with El Paso and our, you know, are becoming in many ways more progressive is that it's happened very organically. I feel like we're not, you know, we're not copying Austin or San Antonio. It's our own brand of progressive. And I think I see that in the art. I see that in the messaging. And the fact is that because we're so close to Juarez, there is just so much cross collaboration. And I think that's really what makes us uniquely progressive. But there's still a lot of work to do because people are still not necessarily in the habit of voting.
Exactly.
It's still not a family event, right? It's still not something that you do routinely. And it really is something that takes some practice, where you just routinely start to look out for elections and to look forward to them and to investigate who you're going to vote for, and then hold those people accountable once they're in office.
Exactly. And that sort of distrust or just apathy that that many community members have towards voting might come from the fact that, like you mentioned, previous city councils have just disregarded a lot of community members for who they are. And so I wanted to shift gears to talk a little bit about the El Paso Green New Deal Summit that Sunrise organized and that you participated in April. So what was your impression of the project? And can you tell us why you support this sort of intersectional Green New Deal solutions for El Paso instead of traditional incremental policy solutions?
Well, I think it was extremely well run, and I was very impressed with the just the caliber of the discussion, and the fact that Sunrise did not shy away from having some hard conversations and was very clear about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. And what I think you are doing and want to do is to take on huge challenges. And that means, getting into the intersectionality of the environmental issues that we are facing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's just we're out of time. And so that is really the reason why we have to look at these issues now and look at them aggressively. The pandemic has given us a forced glimpse at what happens when the majority of Americans stay home and reduce their carbon footprint. Now, that has been shifted, right? Because people are still buying things online. Mm-hmm. PPE is still produced primarily from plastic, and that's being thrown away on a daily basis. But we do have, I think, ways to really mark our progress. We have air monitors that are telling us that the air is cleaner when we stay home. That, we've, and it's going to be interesting for me to see, and I hope that people start doing this, to really track our consumption during this time period when it comes to our utilities. And when it comes to, even our purchasing decisions moving forward. It is possible that this pandemic has given us an idea of what is essential and what is not. And without us addressing our consumer patterns and tying those into labor practices, into financial consumption patterns, right, that for my clients are debilitating because they have so much debt, and it's over things that are not of value often. When it comes to thinking about how all of those things relate to the environment, I think that this is a prime time for us to really step back and take a look and see what, again, what is essential and what is not. And we're seeing it with some people. Some people are just like, they're not listening to that part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. They want to be out, they want to go shopping, they want retail therapy. And so I think that's where we need to shift some of the conversations in terms of what that means, right? When we even say things like that, what does it mean for you to seek some sort of relaxation by consuming? Exactly. And what is that consumption? Really, what is it, right? Is it of value to you at the end of the day? But also, what were the labor practices that brought you that thing to your hands? The transportation practices, the production practices. And I'm hoping that what you all are doing will elevate the conversation, as painful as it may be, to really start talking about environmental justice as it relates to food security, job security, thinking about people who are often left out of these conversations, people who have no choice but to use public transit, people who have disabilities and both physical and mental that are left out of the conversation often. How we start to reframe what is important and what community means. I think that's really what I saw of value in the summit, is that you're shifting the conversation in a very dramatic way, and there's no time to have anything that's not dramatic at this point in time.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think that's a great way to end this conversation. You know, a lot of us relate to your perspective and your background as being an environmentalist, but also a community advocate first and foremost, right? So, can you tell your viewers where they can contact you and get in touch with your campaign?
Yes. So our website is veroformayor.com, and you can email us at veroformayor2020@gmail.com.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully, you can join us at another time. We love having these conversations with you. But yeah, until next time, thank you for joining.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.